I previously made a video on how the Marvel Cinematic Universe changed the film industry, and there's no question that it made a seismic shift in how movies are made. But today I want to analyze the franchise itself a bit further. You see, while the franchise is still churning out content, it is not nearly what it used to be in terms of consistent quality or in terms of fan engagement. So I wanted to pinpoint the exact moment that the pendulum started to swing into a negative direction. And this may be a hot take, but after careful consideration, I think that Avengers Endgame was the death of the MCU. I know, it's the highest grossing film in the entire cinematic universe, and is widely regarded as a top 5 MCU movie, but I do firmly believe that this is what started the clock on the MCU's expiration date, as it truly does serve as a perfect conclusion to the two pillars of the MCU in Captain America and Iron Man. Steve and Tony were both Phase 1 heroes, were seen as the leaders of the Avengers, and Civil War made it pretty clear that they were the two most important pieces on the board. And that doesn't just go for the narrative of the universe, it also goes for the studio itself, as both characters got trilogies, which both ended with the third film cracking the $1 billion mark at the box office, and they headlined each of the 4 Avengers films, which all also raked in over $1 billion. All this to say that it may be called the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but most people were really here for a few specific characters, whether that be Cap, or Iron Man, or Spider-Man, or the Guardians. Most people had a few characters that got them into the MCU, and they primarily saw other movies in the universe to keep track of where things were heading, so that they wouldn't be lost when they went to see the films headlining their favorites. And Endgame is a beautiful climax and finale to Natasha, Steve, and Tony's story. But the issue is, that means it was also the jumping off point for a lot of fans. Though the MCU did a good job at combating this with its next entry, as Spider-Man Far From Home serves as a passing of the torch from Tony to Spider-Man, that allowed fans to grieve the loss of Iron Man alongside Peter. But once the grieving was out of our systems and the epilogue to the Infinity Saga was over, well, a big problem presented itself. How do you top Thanos as a villain and the insane build of the previous phases? Well, truth be told, I think the MCU should have stopped. At least for a few years, maybe even 5. Just stop, give everyone time to breathe, and let fan anticipation slowly build organically, as absence does make the heart grow fonder. And I think this can be seen with Star Wars as well, as the time between trilogies is really key in building fan anticipation, and when Disney flooded the movie market with too much Star Wars by making a new one every year for 5 years straight, well, that anticipation died a slow death, because the movies felt so unconnected and weren't building to anything, so it became obvious to fans that the studio was just trying to lazily rake in some money. And I think this is the trap that the MCU fell into. Because it had been so successful for so long, they just tried to keep going right along as if nothing had changed. But in reality, everything had. We no longer had a tangible end goal, and the content started feeling more and more detached, as without a unifying direction, the studio would just attempt to step into a plethora of genres, from sitcom to horror to teen drama to legal drama. This in an attempt to reach as many demographics as possible, but this spread the MCU too thin, and without anything connecting all of his projects, these attempts to put an MCU spin on established genres just felt like cheap knockoffs that wouldn't appeal to fans of the genre or matter to the larger stakes of the MCU, so what was the point really? If you asked an MCU fan who the two most important characters were prior to Infinity War, it would have taken them approximately 2 seconds to tell you it was Iron Man and Captain America. Now, if you asked me that same question, I don't even know who I'd come up with. Maybe Kang? But now it's not even clear if he'll be the big bad moving forward with the whole Jonathan Majors situation. And I think this confusion exists because the MCU failed to create or establish characters who could serve as these new pillars going forward. I guess you could argue Spider-Man was meant to be one of these pillars, but given the contract situation with Sony, and the fact that Marvel Studios doesn't even own the rights to the character, it was foolish to think he could serve as your lead going forward. And you may be thinking to yourself that the MCU has had some big films post-Endgame, so how could it be dead? But I think what their biggest films are post-Endgame prove that the MCU is out of juice. Spider-Man No Way Home was such a big deal because the film's completely outside of the MCU. Seeing Andrew and especially Tobey reprise their roles as Spider-Man and getting to see previous Sony Spider-Man villains is what made that film so special. And then moving right into Multiverse of Madness, well, the title and trailers teased even more out-of-verse characters, such as Professor X. But this kind of fan anticipation is simply nostalgia bait, and there's a finite amount of times that the MCU can pull this card, as there's only so many non-MCU Marvel characters who have appeared in movies on the big screen, and after Wolverine appears in Deadpool 3, they're kind of out of ammunition in this department, so we'll just be right back at square one, with a bunch of MCU characters that we don't really care too much about, because the franchise has essentially fed us nostalgic non-MCU characters for the past few years. Even with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and Wakanda Forever, which were both financially successful, I'd argue they were in large part successful for reasons that the MCU had very little to do with, as the cultural impact of the first Black Panther film and the tragic passing of Chadwick Boseman in real life are largely what drew intrigue and sentimentality to Wakanda Forever. And with Guardians of the Galaxy, it was the swan song for the Guardians, and for James Gunn as well, before he heads over to the DCU for good, so I find the success of both of these films to be unrepeatable, and for as good as both may have been, neither built to an interesting new direction or overall goal for the universe as a whole. They were both extremely self-contained stories, so I feel like the future of the MCU is looking bleak, because every successful film after Avengers Endgame is either a one-off self-contained story that succeeded for reasons outside of the verse, or are large nostalgia bait driven spectacles which will diminish in value as you bring back these non-MCU characters more and more. I think a big reason for the lack of connectivity in MCU content post-Endgame is due to the studio's expansion into Disney Plus content. Their television series, whether or not they're even any good, do not connect to each other in any meaningful way more times than not. And I think this is because the studio was afraid that their movie-going audience might not translate into a Disney Plus audience, so they wanted to make sure that you didn't need to watch any of the shows to still understand what was generally happening in the movies. And I think this fear kind of highlights that it wasn't the studio's idea to expand into the TV world, but rather Disney forcing their hand. Because Disney wanted to gain and maintain subscriptions for their streaming service, and the MCU was its biggest property at the time, so why not have them churn out some series for you? Well, the reason they shouldn't have done this is because it diluted and oversaturated Marvel content. And it is clear from the quality of many of these shows that the studio is not nearly as good at making their ideas into an episodic series, as Marvel Studios had many years to hone its movie-making skills, but kind of just got thrown into the TV world. And you may be thinking to yourself, but hey, what about Loki? And yeah, Loki was really good, but just like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, it not only doesn't build to anything, but it serves as the perfect swan song for an MCU mainstay in Loki. So yeah, it was one of a few bright spots for the MCU post-Avengers Endgame, but did the finale of Loki Season 2 make anyone excited to go see the Marvels? Based off the box office that the Marvels pulled in, I would venture to say no, and that's the biggest mark that the current MCU is missing compared to when it was thriving. By the time you finished one movie, you were tangibly excited to see the next, and now, well, you just kind of pick and choose what you want to watch, and as we get further and further removed from Endgame, what people are picking to watch is on a steady decline. All in all, I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe was largely built on creating really organic fan anticipation, which allowed fans to buy into the cinematic world, because we had a clear climax that was being built to, from the first Avengers film all the way to Endgame. But Endgame was debatably the biggest climax that any franchise has ever had, and while it now presents the question of, how do you top or even just try to rival that? And while I suppose it is possible that the MCU will come up with an answer at some point, until it does, I firmly believe that Endgame will be viewed as what started the slow death of the MCU. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this analysis of the MCU, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. And remember, this is just my opinion, so if you agree, disagree, or just have strong MCU thoughts, as always, I'd love to hear them in the comments.